In the heart of early medieval Europe, the Germanic Franks lived amid deep forests and winding river valleys, a world shaped by raw nature, hard labor, and the turning of the seasons. As winter crept across their lands, life began to close in. The ground hardened, fields fell silent, and gathering fresh food was no longer possible. From that moment on, survival depended entirely on what had already been set aside. For Frankish families, the stores prepared before winter would decide whether the cold months were endured or feared. Without refrigeration or modern preservatives, they relied on methods of food storage that were quiet, careful, and perfected through generations of necessity. How did Germanic Franks keep meat, grain, and vegetables edible through long, brutal winters without modern preservation? And why do many of their methods seem more stable than the systems we rely on today? Stay with us as we uncover how early Germanic peoples prepared for winter and what their methods reveal about survival, restraint, and planning. The world the Germanic Franks lived in. The Germanic Franks lived in a landscape defined by sharp seasonal contrast. Summers were short and demanding, filled with planting, tending, and harvesting. Winters were long, dark, and unforgiving, shutting down nearly all food production. Once the cold settled in, the land offered very little in return. Hunting became unpredictable as animals migrated or grew scarce. Crops could not grow beneath frozen soil, rivers slowed, roads became difficult, and travel often stopped entirely. Communities became inward-looking, focused on endurance rather than expansion. Because of this reality, survival depended far less on what could be gathered in winter, and far more on what had already been prepared. Food storage was not a secondary concern or a seasonal chore, it was the foundation of life itself. Every household understood that winter could not be negotiated with optimism. It had to be faced with preparation, discipline, and memory of past failures. Food as a seasonal responsibility. Among the Germanic Franks, food was inseparable from time. Each season carried its own duties, and preservation was the bridge between abundance and scarcity. Summer and autumn were not only about eating well, but about preparing wisely. Harvest did not mark completion, it marked the beginning of long weeks of work dedicated to storage. Animals were slaughtered carefully. Grain was dried and sorted, fires burned steadily for smoking, vegetables were prepared for burial or fermentation. Nothing was stored without purpose. Every preserved item represented meals that could not be replaced once winter arrived. This awareness shaped restraint and planning at every step. Food was not only nourishment, it was responsibility carried forward into the months ahead. Drying, removing what spoils first. Drying was one of the most common and dependable preservation methods used by the Germanic Franks. Through experience, they understood that moisture was the first step toward decay. Removing it slowed spoilage before it began. Meat was sliced thin and exposed to air. Fish was split and laid out carefully. Fruits, herbs, and mushrooms were spread near hearths or in open spaces where airflow could do its work. As moisture left the food, stability increased. Mold formed less easily, insects were discouraged. Food became lighter, smaller, and easier to store. Drying turned short-lived food into something that could quietly wait through winter without constant attention. Smoking. Preservation through fire and time. Smoking built on drying by using fire in a controlled and patient way. Meat and fish were hung above slow-burning fires where smoke could reach them gently. This process often lasted many days. Smoke dried food further while coating it with compounds that discouraged insects and slowed decay. The surface hardened gradually, protecting what lay beneath. Smokehouses were simple structures, sometimes part of the living space itself. Fire provided warmth, light, and preservation at once. Through smoking, the Franks turned an everyday necessity into long-term security. Salting, when minerals became life-saving. Salt was a valuable resource among the Germanic Franks. It was obtained through trade or labor and used with care. When applied to meat, salt drew out moisture quickly. This created conditions where decay struggled to survive. Properly salted meat could last for months when stored correctly. Salt also allowed meat to be stored in smaller spaces, making winter stores more compact and easier to manage within homes where storage space was limited. Salted food was never eaten casually. It was rationed, soaked before cooking, and prepared slowly. Its strength reminded people that preserved food was meant to endure. Salting reflected planning and restraint rather than abundance. Fermentation, letting food change to survive. The Franks also relied on fermentation, guided by observation rather than explanation. Vegetables like cabbage and turnips were stored to allow slow, controlled change. Grains and dairy were also transformed into forms that resisted spoilage. Fermented foods also reduced reliance on fresh supplies, ensuring nourishment continued even when weather or isolation cut communities off from outside resources. Sour flavors and altered textures were accepted as signs of survival, not failure. Once fermentation began, little effort was required. Food continued preserving itself quietly through the winter months. Time became an ally rather than an enemy. Grain storage, protecting the foundation of life. Grain was the most important stored food for the Germanic Franks. Bread and porridge depended on it, making its protection essential. After harvest, grain was dried thoroughly to remove hidden moisture. It was stored whole rather than ground to extend its life. Storage places were raised or sealed to keep out dampness and pests. Grain was checked occasionally but disturbed as little as possible. Grain stores were often guarded closely, as their loss could mean hunger regardless of how much meat or vegetables remained preserved. Without grain, even preserved meat could not sustain life through winter. Root cellars and earth storage. The ground itself became a preserving tool for the Franks. Root vegetables were stored underground where temperatures remained steady. Earth protected food from freezing while preventing sudden warmth that caused spoilage. Pits and cellars were carefully placed to manage moisture. This underground storage also protected food from animals and theft, keeping winter supplies hidden, stable, and accessible only to those who prepared them. Turnips, carrots, and onions could last for months when stored correctly. Once prepared, these spaces required little attention. The land itself helped carry food through winter. Storage as a social system. Food preservation was never private knowledge. It belonged to families and communities rather than individuals. Methods were learned through watching and remembering. Seasonal gatherings and shared labor reinforced this knowledge, turning preservation into a communal rhythm rather than an isolated household task. Mistakes were shared. Successes became tradition. This shared understanding reduced risk. When one household failed, others learned from it. Survival was collective, shaped by memory rather than instruction. Why Germanic storage worked? Germanic storage methods worked because they respected limits. Food was preserved in ways that matched the environment instead of fighting it. These systems remained effective even when weather patterns shifted, because they were flexible enough to adapt without needing redesign or external support. Once prepared, food required little energy or attention. Stability came from early effort rather than constant control. These methods created independence from fragile systems. Preservation continued even when conditions worsened. What endured was not convenience, but resilience. The shift toward modern storage. Modern storage introduced a different approach. Refrigeration and freezing aimed to stop natural processes entirely. Food began to depend on machines and continuous energy. Preservation shifted away from preparation toward control. As storage moved away from households, people became less involved in the preservation process and more detached from how long food could truly last. These systems worked well under stable conditions, but assumed uninterrupted support. Dependence quietly replaced resilience. Why modern storage fails differently. When modern storage fails, spoilage is sudden. Power outages or equipment breakdowns can destroy food quickly. Loss often happens without warning. Because failure is sudden, modern systems leave little time to adapt, forcing people to react rather than respond with intention. Large quantities are ruined at once. Germanic methods failed slowly. Changes were visible and gradual. Food could be used before it became dangerous. Failure unfolded differently because the systems were different. Comparison comes into focus. The contrast between these approaches becomes clear under stress. The Franks preserved food by transforming it. Modern systems preserve food by suspending it. One works with time, the other resists it. This contrast reveals why older methods endured across centuries, surviving political change, climate variation, and isolation without needing constant reinforcement. When disruption occurs, transformation survives while suspension collapses. The difference is philosophical as much as practical. What we forgot about winter preparation. The Germanic Franks stored food because they expected hardship. Winter was never treated as predictable. Modern systems assume stability and constant support. Preparation once meant accepting discomfort early to avoid crisis later, a trade. Modern systems often postpone until disruption makes choices unavoidable. Preparation became lighter as confidence grew. What was forgotten was not technique but mindset. Older methods were cautious by design. They were built for survival, not convenience. Germanic Franks survived winter through understanding rather than technology. They dried, smoked, salted, fermented, and buried food in ways that worked quietly through the cold months. Their methods demanded effort before winter arrived, but rewarded them with independence when it mattered most. What they preserved was not just food, but resilience. Winter once forced people to think carefully about what they could rely on. The Germanic Frankish ways of storing food still raise important questions today. Which of these methods feel surprisingly relevant now, and which ones have we left behind too easily? Share your thoughts and stay with us as we continue exploring how ancient lives were shaped by necessity, restraint, and survival.